I feel like autumn is the time of the year where you're either having an existential crisis or you're the most productive person that you have ever met. I mean, you're either bed rotting or you're doing all of the chores that you plan to do next year. But autumn is also the perfect time for you to read some good books before the year is over. So here I am with 5 novels that I believe you should read this autumn before the year is over. And believe me, I am not wrong when I say that these books are amazing and you have to read them at least once in your life. Now, some of them are based on aestheticism, the general vibes that we associate with autumn, while others are more darker, complex pieces of fiction. Now, before I begin, I have to preface this video by saying that the autumnal vibes I spoke about are something that I have never experienced in my own life because I live in a maritime climate. Which means we don't have autumn, we have the season of retreating monsoon and October heat, which means that every October the days are filled with rain, rain, and more rain. And when it is not raining, we have sultry, oppressive weather because of low pressure conditions. And it is generally a very bad time to exist. So, if you are someone who lives on the other side of the world, then consider yourself blessed because you actually have autumn and not extended summer with rain in it like we do here near the equator. Okay, so with my seasonal rant over, let's talk about the first book on this list, which is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. If you have seen the show on Netflix by Mike Flanagan or the 1963 or 1999 adaptation, I want you to purge those from your mind because you have to read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson with a clear, open mind, with no preconceived notions about how the novel is going to be. Because trust me when I say this is one of the best pieces of horror fiction to ever exist. I mean, the first paragraph of this novel, the first line, let alone the paragraph, is one of the most iconic lines to ever exist. No living organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even large psychiatrists are supposed by some to dream. And that single sentence, that sentence tells you how good this book is going to be. It draws you in from the very first page and does not let you go, just like the titular Hill House draws in the characters and does not let them go until it has absolutely corrupted their minds and soul and is one step away from consuming them completely. So The Haunting of Hill House, the horror novel, is a ghost novel without any ghosts in it, and that I think is one of the most unique features about it. The Haunting of Hill House is based around the titular Hill House, where Dr. Montague is conducting a paranormal study. He wants to see if the earlier residents of Hill House actually face paranormal activity or where they simply overcome by the delusions of their mind while living in a dreary place like Hill House. In order to do so, he invites recipients from all over the country who have faced psychic activity or poltergeist activity in one way or another. But his letters are answered only by 2 women. Theodora, a woman who claims to have psychic powers, and Eleanor, a woman who faced ghostly activity in her youth but has long since forgotten the incident, and at her core, a woman who is extremely, extremely lonely. She has spent her formative years taking care of her ailing mother, and currently she lives with her sister, who she is clearly not very fond of, her brother-in-law, and her niece. And her living situation is one of the primary reasons for her underlying anxiety because apart from that, she does not have anything. Most of her life has been centered around other people and pleasing other people to such an extent that she has repressed all of her desires, all of her feelings. And when she arrives at Hill House, alongside Theodora, alongside Dr. Montague, who is being assisted by Luke, the heir to Hill House, the house digs deep into her and brings out those desires, brings out the little girl who is hidden deep within her, brings out the little girl who insists on her cup of stars or insists on getting her way. And ultimately, that is the downfall of everyone who comes to live at Hill House. Now, the entire premise of Hill House is that the house itself is the horror here. There are no other ghosts or other paranormal instances which makes the house terrifying. Or as Eleanor puts it, the house itself is wild. It's the wildest place that she has ever put her feet into. But in some way, the house is also one of the safest places that Eleanor has been in. I believe that Hill House works very well as not only a representation of the repression that women have to face throughout their lives under a patriarchal society, but also of queer repression and the intersectionality between queer women and patriarchal society. Overall, Hill House is a novel that everyone has to read once in their life. I have a lot of contentions about the adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House by Mike Flanagan on Netflix, because that is one of the most popular adaptations that exist of a horror novel. The entire essence is that the novel is about female loneliness, how the ideal of the nuclear family leaves out people who do not have the opportunity to create such a family, especially queer women and people who are marginalized in some way or another. Whereas the show somehow brushed over the thematic critique of nuclear family and the representation of female loneliness and queer desire, and turned it into some sort of package deal of family love, sibling bonding, and how love between family members can strive off even the greatest evil. While the show is not bad, it is not a very faithful adaptation of the novel and only borrows the title and the setting from the novel and is more or less an original creation. Now, I do believe that sometimes changes from adaptation to adaptation are extremely necessary, and The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson is not a very easy novel to adapt. But I'm also very angry about the show because whenever I am reminded of it, I am also reminded of the fact that we will never get a faithful adaptation of Haunting of Hill House in all of its uniqueness, in all of its originality, in all of its complexities. And some part of me is okay with that because I can always read the novel, which is perfect in its own way. But another part of me always feels angry about it because the Mike Flanagan show is much more accessible than the novel to the general audience who are more inclined to watch stuff than read stuff. But we take what we get. And if you are someone who wants to read a horror novel right now in spooky season, then go ahead and read The Haunting of Hill House. Trust me, you will not regret it. This is one of the horror novels that I think is so amazingly written that the prose itself makes up for reading it. Like, even if this was a grocery list written by Shirley Jackson, I kid you not, I would have read it with as much fervor as I did The Haunting of Hill House. Fine, enough about The Haunting of Hill House, because if given the opportunity, I would spend the rest of this video talking about this novel. But let's move on to the next book on this list, which is a tad bit lighter than The Haunting of Hill House, but no less amazing. She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. She Who Became the Sun is very different from the earlier novel, but no less well written. She Who Became the Sun is a fantasy novel which retells the story of a Chinese emperor Zhu Chongba or Zhu Yongzong. I'm so sorry for butchering the name. Please feel free to correct me in the comments. But yes, I tried my best to pronounce it, but I'm pretty sure I did that wrong. So here the author retells the story of Zhu Shongba as someone who was originally female or assigned female at birth. When young Zhu is taken to a clairvoyant in her youth alongside her brother, whose actual name is Zhu Chongba, and the little girl who grows up to be Zhu Chongba is unnamed, she is told that she is destined for nothing while her brother is destined for greatness. But soon after, when her brother and father are both killed by bandits, she takes up her brother's name and pretends to be a boy in order to get into a nearby monastery. And somewhere along the way, by stealing her brother's name, she also steals his destiny and tends to believe that she too is destined for greatness. I think She Who Became the Sun is one of the best portrayals of genderqueer characters that I have read, especially in fantasy fiction. Though I do have some contentions with the novel which I'll follow up soon, but She Who Became the Sun is a rich fantasy novel with unique world building that focuses on Chinese history. So if you're a history buff, you will also enjoy this novel and its complexity. I enjoyed the parts about warfare the most. I do think that the prose lacks a little bit, especially when it comes to pacing. The first half of the book is more slower compared to the next half, which speeds up terribly fast, making the reader feel a bit disoriented. But overall, She Who Became the Sun, which is a part of the Radiant Emperor duology, is worth the read, especially if you're a new fantasy reader or are looking for more diverse fantasy recommendations, which keep true to the grim dark qualities of more popular fantasies like A Song of Ice and Fire, but are also unique and bring something new to the table, in sharp contrast to the trope-ridden fantasy fiction that we see nowadays. She Who Became the Sun is Above all, a great read simply because of its character, or rather its main character, Zhu Chongba. Zhu Chongba's internal monologue is extremely interesting, and that is contrasted very well with another character's point of view, Noyang, who is a unit general serving in the Mongols' army and secretly plotting his revenge against the Mongol chieftains who murdered his family and left him a eunuch when he pleaded for his life in exchange for eternal service to the chiefs. Ouyang's character is one of the most interesting portrayals that I've ever read, and the way he serves as a character foil to Zhu is one of the most interesting dynamics in the entirety of the duology. And I find that such dynamics are very rare in fantasy fiction, where oftentimes platonic relationships or relationships that serve a more thematic purpose are watered down or washed over for the sake of romantic relationships, and that really drew me into the novel. And I feel that the characterization is a very strong aspect of the duology, which does interest a lot of people and not just me. Now, when I was talking about my contentions about the duology, one of the biggest things that irked me a lot was how the author treats other female characters, which conform to the traditional boundaries of femininity as set by the era that the novel is set in. While Zhu Chongba is allowed to express their masculinity to the fullest extent while also not disregarding their femininity, any other woman in the novel who adheres to the traditional boundaries of femininity is somehow vilified or victimized or seen as good only when they are subservient to Zhu or subscribe to the kind of ideals that Zhu subscribes to. This was evident a lot in Ma Zhuyang's character, who is Zhu's wife. Ma's character is one that I thought would change a lot in the second novel due to an incident that takes place towards the ending of the first novel, but that was not seen at all. I found that Ma's character was watered down a lot to bolster Zhu's character development and Zhu's character growth, which irked me a little bit because, as I previously mentioned, a lot of feminist novels are really centered around the main protagonist and showing how feminist or subversive their main protagonist is at the cost or expense of all the other female characters in the novel, especially the more traditionally female characters in the novel, and She Who Became the Sun is no exception to that. Ma's character is only one example of a character that is watered down. In the second novel in the duology, there is another point of view character who is vilified to a great extent for doing the same things that the other male characters do, for which they are applauded for. So if you're someone who believes that this would be kind of a deal breaker for you, then I don't think She Who Became the Sun is a perfect duology for you. But if you want to give it a try, in spite of the criticisms that I have mentioned, then I can assure you will not regret it, because She Who Became the Sun, in spite of the criticisms, is a very good novel, especially when it comes to modern fantasy. I believe it is one of the best fantasy novels that has been published in the last 5 years, and you should absolutely read it. Alright, moving on to the next novel. Now, this is one of the better known novels on this list, which is Beloved by Toni Morrison. Beloved by Toni Morrison is again another haunted house book, which is much more complex than it seems on the premise. And when I tell you Toni Morrison has a Nobel Prize in Literature for a reason, I absolutely mean it. Beloved by Toni Morrison follows Seeth, a woman who was born a slave but has now been freed for 18 years and lives in Ohio with her nearly adult daughter. But her home is haunted by the ghost of her baby who died nameless, with only one word on her tombstone: beloved. Seeth's life takes a turn for the worse when a young woman called Beloved appears at her home, and Seeth believes this woman to be the grown-up version of her deceased baby Beloved. Now, the haunting here is much more metaphorical than literal. The haunting here is the devastating impact that slavery has left and the generational trauma that carries on among the families of the slaves and among those who have descended from slaves. Because slavery is this huge wound that has affected Black people across America that cannot be healed no matter how many years you spend free, because that level of dehumanization is something that intrinsically changes a person and gives irreparable damage to generations to come. Beloved by Toni Morrison is a hauntingly beautiful novel. It is so poignant, also incredibly hard to read. Apart from the prose and the themes of the novel, one of the best parts of Beloved by Toni Morrison is that its plot structure and Morrison's skill as a storyteller. This is a novel that has you hooked till the last page, no matter how unpalatable its subject matter is. It is unflinching, poignant, and brutal. It is not a novel that makes history more digestible for you. It does not dress up history so that you can pat yourself on the back and feel good about it, but rather a raw and brutal portrayal of what actually took place. And this is one novel that I believe everyone should read, especially if you're living in a country that has had some history of slavery in it or some history of violence against minorities in it. There is something about horror novels which have haunted houses in them, but the real horror is not the house itself, but perhaps the events that took place in the house, or perhaps the way the house affects people. For example, in Haunting of the Hill House, the house is more or less a sanctuary hidden from around the world for Eleanor to express herself in, and in Beloved, the house is a representation of the hard-earned freedom that Seth has received, but what is still haunted by the trauma and the legacy of slavery that she had to endure in her youth, and that trauma which was passed on to her children. And this sort of metaphorical haunting is something that I find much more interesting than cheapsake horror, which relies upon shock value or the use of ghosts in order to make its point. Anyways, let's move on to the next novel on this list, which is Noia by Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, Noia by Jean-Paul Sartre is a seminal text in existentialist fiction. It follows Antoine Rollin-Quinn, who goes into this existential crisis when he realizes that anything that he does in life does not truly have a meaning, and that he has free will which he can express in any way that he wants. And truly, in order to make a summary of this novel, there is not much more that I can say than that, because the entirety of that novel is about Antoine and his coming to face with the inherent truth about his existence. I think before or after reading Noia by Jean-Paul Sartre, you must read Existentialism is a Humanism, which very well explains the core tenets of what Sartre is trying to say through Noia, where he brings up the points of essence versus existence. Now, I believe Noia is a very important novel to read because it truly shaped the literary and political landscape of the era that it was published in. I mean, Noia is perhaps a book that you have to start with before diving more into the works of Camus or Kafka or even Simone de Beauvoir. And Noia is also a very good read, one that I loved reading a lot. I finished it in one sitting, and I believe that especially when you're at an age from 17 to 25, where you're still figuring out what to do with life, what to do next, where to go next, and essentially the entire meaning behind your existence, Noia is a novel that is going to help you a lot. Now, I was discussing this with a peer of mine, and how Noia to the modern generation might sound a lot like jargon and deluded blabberings, because it is written in stream of consciousness. So a lot of the parts of the novel are unbroken musings about the nature of existence and how Antoine is feeling in relation to the people around him, and that may drive a lot of people away from this novel. But I believe that if you can look over that fact and actually use your attention span in order to read this book thoroughly, this is a novel that you will never regret reading. I mean, it's one of its kind novel. It is one of those novels which defines how we see literature in the 21st century. And of course, if you're someone who has a lot of free time in the end of the year, because of course we have a lot of vacations during this time. For me personally, I have most of October off because it is the festival month for me, and then a lot of nations will have December off because of Christmas holidays and winter vacations. Then Noia is a novel that you have to make your way through in your off time. But yes, Noia by Jean-Paul Sartre is one novel that you have to read this autumn, and there is no better time in the year to have an existential crisis in than October. This is a month that screams crisis. This is the month where you want to curl up under your covers or dig a hole and crawl into it and never come out again. I don't know why, but October is a month where your seasonal depression hits the hardest, and no matter what happens, you simply cannot find a meaning behind your suffering, and you're also overcome by the indifference that other people showed your suffering. So yes, What I'm saying is, there is no better time to read Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre than the month of October to November. Now let's go on to the last book on this list, and I'm so glad we're coming to the end of this list, because if given the opportunity, I'm going to speak for an hour more, but that is very painful on my voice, which is always half dead at this point. Alright, so the last book on this list is The Spirit Bears Its Teeth. So The Spirit Bears Its Teeth is set in the alternate version of the world as we know it, and in the Victorian era United Kingdom, more specifically in Victorian era London, where the veil between the living and the dead has thinned, and there are people who are able to see these ghosts better than the others, and they are distinguished by their unique violet eyes. Silas Bell, a young trans man, is one of those violet-eyed seers, but as he is assigned female at birth, then the patriarchal society has imposed upon him the idea that his only value in life is to get married to another seer and add children to the seer population by making use of what God has given him. But Silas insists that that should not be his fate, and after a failed attempt to escape his destiny, he is sent to a psychiatric institution after being misdiagnosed with wheel sickness, a sickness that is making women with the power to see the dead, the power to interact with the dead, go slowly insane. Now, this is a novel that deals a lot with Victorian era and the idea of hysteria, or how women who were suffering from mental illnesses such as depression or anxiety, or in some cases postpartum depression, were sentenced with hysteria and oftentimes given involuntary lobotomies, and sometimes even women who decided to rebel against patriarchal standards or behave in a way that was deemed unfit for them were diagnosed with hysteria and treated horribly. And this novel uses a lot of that as inspiration and is one of the most chilling, gripping novels that I read last year. I mean, this had me shaking in my bed because the body horror here is insane. And I am recommending this book as someone who disliked author's previous novel a lot, like a lot. I have a huge video on it why I disliked that novel, because of its surface level diversity politics and how it used characters with different ethnicities or with different backgrounds without any logical reasoning behind it, or without actually digging deep into how the different backgrounds of the characters might affect their relationships with each other, might affect their reactions to the political situation that was caused by the eco-fascist cult that the author was trying to portray. But in The Spirit Bears Its Teeth, the author has outdone themselves while writing this novel, because I felt that a lot of the weak points of the earlier novel were not present here, and this was one of the strongest horror novels that I have read in my entire life. I mean, when I tell you this is terrifying, I mean it. This is actually very, very terrifying. Especially in the moments where Silas is trying to figure out the mystery in the psychiatric institution he has been sent to, where where the woman sentenced to it earlier had gone missing in horrific ways or were mutilated. And when he interacts with those ghosts in order to find out what happened to them, those sections will literally make the hair on your body stand. You will feel shivers down your spine while reading this novel. And moreover, I really enjoyed being in the main character's mind while the entire thing was going on. The author's prose is excellent here. While I found the main characters in his earlier novels to be very flat, very one-dimensional, this novel truly proved my preconceived notions about Andrew's writing wrong, because here the characters are not one-dimensional at all, especially the main characters, while the side characters may at times feel a little flat, a little one-dimensional. I think the entire the atmospheric writing, the well-structured plot, and the horror that is present as like an undercurrent throughout the novel makes one overlook the side characters a lot. I mean, whenever I speak about The Spirit Bears Its Teeth, I am downright fangirling. But when I read it, I was shaking. I was reading it at like 12 a.m. in the month of November last year. I was under the blanket because it was a little cold, and I was on vacation in Kurseong that time with my friends, and while I was reading it, I was literally shaking. I was so scared because I was in a place that I did not know. I was literally living in a convent at that point, which was nestled right in between the hills. So if you leave your room and go out and look through a window, the only thing that you're going to see for miles is fog and trees and the silent chirping of crickets, and nothing else for hours and nothing else for miles and miles on end. And you truly feel like you're the only person in that valley, and on top of that you're reading a novel that is downright horrifying. I cannot put into words how scared I was. I mean, at a point I was under 5 different blankets with my eyes closed, just trying to forget what I had read, because this book is that gruesome. Now, it might feel like I'm exaggerating my experience reading this because of the location that I was in, but trust me, even if you are living in a place with 20 degrees Celsius or 27 degrees Celsius like I am right now, this book is still going to scare you. And this is a novel that you have to read at least once in your life if you are a horror buff, or if you're looking for more queer horror, especially something that deals with body horror. Because as someone who is not easily fazed by horror, and is not very easily affected by the darkest of horrors, this was a novel that just made me pause and rethink my decision to ever start reading it. I do think that the ending was a bit rushed, like 2 3 more chapters could really have made it a perfect ending. But I'm not really complaining, because the first 90% of this novel is top tier. It's excellent. And someone who started reading this book with very less expectations, I was simply blown away. And you guys know how much of a hater I am. I mean, this video should come as a surprise to you, because I just spent 30 minutes talking about books that I love and not hating or tearing apart a novel that I disliked reading. Anyways, as we come to the end of this video, if you liked watching it, make sure to like, share and subscribe. Leave a comment down below or recommend a book to me which you think I should read this fall, or let's just talk about the books that I mentioned in this video. If you have read them, if you want to read them, or if someone you know has a poor opinion on them, so we can talk shit about that person. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and bye bye.